All right, let's dive into what is honestly one of the most explosive chapters in the entire Bible, Mark chapter 2. I mean, this isn't just a bunch of stories about miracles. No, this is a masterclass in confrontation, and it builds verse by verse. We're going to walk through 4 incredible scenes where the tension just keeps ramping up, and each one reveals something absolutely crucial about who Jesus claims to be. Seriously, by the time we're done, these stories are going to be burned into your memory.
So, we've got 4 main scenes to look at. First up, there's a healing so wild it literally brings the house down. Then, we're crashing a dinner party that shatters every social rule you can think of. After that, Jesus drops these powerful metaphors about new wine and old rules, and it all leads to this massive final showdown over the Sabbath. All right, let's jump into that first scene.
Okay, so we're starting off with the healing through the roof. This whole thing is a desperate act of faith that raises the stakes and, well, the ceiling.
Okay, so verse 1 kicks things off. Jesus is back in Capernaum, just hanging out in a house, kind of his home base. And then in verse 2, word gets out, and I mean, the place is immediately mobbed. You've got to picture this. It's not just full, it's a human traffic jam. People are spilling out the door. You couldn't get in if you tried. And right there, in the middle of all that chaos, Jesus is just calmly teaching.
And this is where it gets crazy. Verse 3, these 4 guys show up, and they're carrying their paralyzed friend on a mat. They are absolutely determined to get him to Jesus. But like we said, verse 4 makes it clear. There's no way through the door. The crowd is just a solid wall of people. So what do? They get creative. They climb up on the roof. These were flat clay roofs. And they just start digging, tearing a hole right through the ceiling. Can you imagine being inside? Suddenly there's dust and bits of straw falling. A beam of light cuts through the room. And a guy on a mat is being lowered right in front of Jesus. Now that is how you make an entrance.
So in verse 5, Jesus looks up and he sees their faith. And I'm not just talking about the paralyzed guy. He sees the insane, roof-destroying faith of his buddies. And then he says something that just stops everyone cold. Nobody saw this coming. He looks right at the man on the mat and says, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Imagine the silence in that room. Everybody's thinking, wait, what? They brought him there to be healed physically, right? But Jesus goes straight for the spiritual issue, what he sees as the deeper problem.
All right, verse 6. This is where the villains of the story enter the picture. You've got these scribes, the religious experts, just sitting there in the crowd, watching everything. And you can almost see the smoke coming out of their ears. Verse 7 lets us in on their thoughts. They're thinking, who does this guy think he is? This is blasphemy. Only God can forgive sins. They haven't said a single word out loud, but in their heads, they've just sentenced him to death for this.
But here's the thing. In verse 8, it says Jesus knew immediately what they were thinking. He just knew. So he calls them out. He looks at them and says, "Why are you raising questions in your hearts?" And then, verse 9, he sets this perfect trap for them. He asks, "So tell me, which is easier, to say your sins are forgiven, or to say get up, pick up your mat, and walk?" And you got to think about that for a second. It's a brilliant question. I mean, anyone can say your sins are forgiven. How do you prove that? You can't. But telling a paralyzed man to get up and walk, well, that's something everyone's going to see, one way or another.
So in verse 10, Jesus basically spells it out for them. He says, look, just so you know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. And he lets that sink in. Son of Man, that's a huge deal. It's a title straight from the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah. He's claiming to be that guy. Then in verse 11, he turns away from the angry scribes, looks right at the man on the floor, and gives the order. I say to you, get up, take your mat, and go home.
In verse 12, it's just immediate. Bam. The guy gets up, picks up the mat he was just lying on, talk about proof, and he walks out, right in front of everybody. The crowd just loses its mind. They're freaking out, praising God, saying, we've never seen anything like this in our lives. In one move, Jesus proved his invisible power with a very, very visible miracle. The mic has been dropped.
Okay, the shockwaves from that miracle are still spreading. And we're jumping right into our next scene, dinner with the outcasts. This is a meal that's going to challenge everything people thought they knew about who's in and who's out. So verse 13, Jesus is by the sea again, and of course, a crowd gathers. Then in verse 14, he's walking along and he sees a guy named Levi. And Levi is sitting at his tax collector's booth. Now we have to understand what this means. Tax collectors were despised. I mean, they were public enemy number 1. They worked for the Romans, the occupying force, and they were known for cheating their own people. They were traitors. And Jesus walks right up to this guy, the most hated man in town, and says two simple words, "Follow me." And just like that, Levi gets up, leaves everything, his job, his money, everything, and follows him. Next thing you know, verse 15, Jesus is having dinner at Levi's house. And look who's on the guest list. It's a whole crew of other tax collectors and people labeled as sinners. Basically, everyone the good religious people wouldn't be caught dead with. And you have to get this. Eating with someone back then was a huge sign of acceptance. It meant you are one of us. So in verse 16, when the scribes and Pharisees see this party going on, they are just disgusted. They pull the disciples aside and are like, "Why on earth is your teacher eating with them?"
Jesus overhears them, of course, and his response in verse 17 is basically his entire mission statement packed into one sentence. He says, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." It's so simple and so profound. He's saying, you're absolutely right. I'm hanging out with the spiritually sick. That's the whole point. You don't find a doctor in a gym, you find him in a hospital. I go where I'm needed.
So first he claims he can forgive sins. Then he says his mission is for sinners. The religious leaders are reeling. And now the conflict shifts to tradition itself. This is where we get into new wine and old rules.
All right, verse 18. A question gets thrown at Jesus. See, both John the Baptist's followers and the Pharisees were super serious about their religion. And one of their big things was fasting. So people come up to Jesus and ask, hey, how come John's disciples and the Pharisees' disciples are always fasting, but your guys are, well, they're not? It's a total job. They're basically saying, your crew doesn't seem very holy. Jesus' answer in verse 19 is just perfect. He uses an analogy everyone would get. He says, you can't expect the wedding guests to fast while the groom is still with them, can you? I mean, obviously not. Who fasts at a wedding party? It's a time to celebrate. He's saying, hello, the groom, the Messiah, is right here. This is the party. But then in verse 20, the mood shifts. He adds, but the days are coming when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and then they will fast. It's a really dark and early hint about his own death.
Then in verse 21, he doubles down with another image to explain why his way is so different. He says, nobody takes a new piece of cloth and uses it to patch an old coat. Why not? Because the first time you wash it, that new patch is going to shrink and it'll just rip a bigger, uglier hole in the old fabric. His point is crystal clear. You can't just slap my teachings like a patch onto your old, worn-out religious system. It's just going to tear everything apart. And he's not done. Verse 22 gives us the most famous metaphor of all. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. See, back then, bottles were made of leather, and new wine is alive. It's still fermenting, it's bubbling, it's expanding. If you pour that into an old, stiff, brittle wineskin, what's going to happen? The pressure builds up and kaboom! The wineskin bursts, you lose the wine, and you lose the wineskin. It's a disaster. His message is so powerful. My teaching, this new thing I'm bringing, is like that new wine. It's full of life. It cannot and will not be contained by your old, rigid religious structures. It needs a completely new container. Which brings us to the final showdown of the chapter. And this one is about the biggest rule of all, the Sabbath. This is where Jesus really pushes all the buttons and makes his most shocking claim yet. This is about who is the Lord of the Sabbath. So verse 23 sets the scene. It's the Sabbath, the day of rest, and Jesus and his disciples are just walking through a grain field. His disciples are hungry, so they start grabbing some heads of grain and snacking on them as they walk. Super casual. But verse 24 tells us the Pharisees are watching. Of course they are, and they pounce. Look, why are your disciples doing what is illegal on the Sabbath? You see, in their super detailed rulebook, picking grain counted as harvesting, which was work, and that was a huge no-no. So in verse 25, Jesus basically schools them using their own scriptures. He's like, have you guys seriously never read what King David did when he and his men were hungry? And then in verse 26, he reminds them of the story. David went into the temple and ate the holy bread, the bread that was technically only for priests. The point is simple, and it's a slam dunk. There's already a precedent in your own Bible where human need, being hungry, was way more important than following a religious ceremony to the letter. Then, in verse 27, he hits them with the core principle. And this statement is a bombshell that flips their entire worldview upside down. He says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Just let that sink in. He's saying the whole point of this sacred day, this law from God, was to be a gift for people, to help them, to restore them. It was never meant to be a prison of rules that people were forced to serve.
And just when you think it can't get any more intense, verse 28 delivers the final knockout punch. This is the climax of the whole chapter. Jesus looks at them and says, "Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." This is just mind-blowing. He's not just arguing about the rules anymore. He is claiming to be the one in charge of the rules. He's saying, I am the authority over this most sacred law. I get to decide what it's all about.
So let's just step back and look at what just happened. In this one single chapter, Jesus has claimed the authority to forgive sins, something only God can do. He's defined his mission as being for the outcasts and the broken. He said his teaching is like new wine that will destroy the old systems. And to top it all off, he's declared that he is the Lord of the Sabbath itself. Every single one of these encounters forces you to ask the same question they were wrestling with back then. After seeing all this, who do you think he is?